All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 9th Annual MSU Science Festival. My name is Catherine Hagman. I'll be your host today. Today we're joined by CIGLR and Christine Kitchens. Hi, Christine. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing good.
Cool. Well, let me go ahead and pull my presentation up.
Wonderful. And while you do that, just as a reminder to everyone who's joining us, feel free to ask questions throughout the talk. If you're joining us on the Zoom webinar, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, feel free to ask your questions in the comment section, and I will be sure to ask them at the end of the session.
All right, good times. Well, I think I'm going to go ahead and get rolling then. So my name is Christine Kitchens. I'm an aquatic ecology research technician at the Cooperative Institute for Great Lakes Research. And today I'll be giving a talk titled Oxygen in Dead Zones and Lakes, Oh My. The goal of which is to help you understand a little bit more about this thing called hypoxia and how it impacts our Great Lakes. All right, well, here we go. There we go. First, I want to talk a little bit about what I do as a research technician, which turns out is a lot of different things. You got a sneak peek at the kind of stuff I do if you listen to Holly's talk, but I do things from going out on the Great Lakes in research boats to collect water samples, to analyzing those samples back at the lab for a lot of different things like algae and nutrients. And I also look at that data and interpret it to try and understand our Great Lakes ecosystems a little bit better. I am also one of the people who is on that really big team of researchers who studies harmful algal blooms, like the one shown in this picture. But the really cool thing about being in research is we don't always study the same thing all the time. For example, when I first started working at CIGLR, I pretty much exclusively studied these harmful algal blooms. But recently, I've had the opportunity to work on a different subject, which can be related to algal blooms. But that subject is something called dead zones, or in technical terms, hypoxia. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, dead zones, hypoxia, what are those? And contrary to this adorable cartoon, dead zones are not places where zombie fish will leap from the water before your very eyes. Although dead fish can actually be involved. It actually has more to do with how much oxygen is in the water. So this can be kind of a weird idea for people to wrap their heads around initially. So last summer, I actually made an educational video to help serve as a visual tool for folks to understand what is hypoxia and how it can impact water quality. And that's what I'm going to be sharing with you guys today. This video can be found on our CIGLR YouTube channel. So if you or someone you know needs a refresher or you want to share it with somebody for the first time, it is out there and readily findable. So let me go ahead and get this guy started. And y'all let me know if you can't hear this.
I'm here to help explain some of the more complicated ideas within Great Lakes science. Today, we're going to talk about the story of hypoxia. However, before we can talk about hypoxia, first we need to talk about oxygen. You know oxygen is important for animals, including people. We need to breathe oxygen to live. It turns out a lot of animals in the water need to breathe oxygen too, including fish, aquatic insects, mussels, and teeny tiny animals called zooplankton. When we talk about the amount of oxygen in the water, we call it dissolved oxygen, or DO.
Why don't we talk a little bit more about dissolved oxygen so that we can make sure everyone understands?
Well, think of it this way. When you take sugar and mix it into water, even if you can't see the sugar anymore, you know it's still in the water. It's just become dissolved in the water. It turns out oxygen in the air can do the same thing. There are a few different things that affect how much dissolved oxygen is in the water. For example, temperature plays a big role in how much dissolved oxygen water can hold. You can dissolve more oxygen in cold water than in warm water. We also tend to find a lot of dissolved oxygen where there's a lot of moving water, like in fast-moving streams. This is because moving water encourages oxygen in the air to become dissolved in water. Finally, another big source of dissolved oxygen in the water are teeny tiny plants called phytoplankton, or algae. Even though I call them tiny plants, it's more accurate to think of phytoplankton as microbes, and that many are the size of a single cell, and you need a microscope to see them, just like with bacteria. Like plants that grow on land, phytoplankton get their food by photosynthesis, which means that they feed themselves using sunlight. The process of photosynthesis doesn't just feed plants, it also creates oxygen.
We've been talking a lot about dissolved oxygen, but what about what we were talking about in the beginning, hypoxia?
Well, let's take a look at this scene. It's springtime in the Great Lakes. The water is cold, and the extra rain and melting snow are causing rivers and streams to come flowing into the lakes. The rivers and streams aren't just bringing extra water to the lake, they're also bringing nutrients, which you can think of as fertilizer for phytoplankton. In the same way putting fertilizer on your lawn or in your garden causes grass to grow and flowers to bloom, nutrients in the lake cause phytoplankton to grow. So the water is cold, we have a lot of wind and waves moving it around, and we have a lot of extra nutrients, which means a lot of happy phytoplankton. What does that mean for the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water? Right. All these things together mean that, in the springtime, there is a lot of dissolved oxygen in the water. In the summer, we have a very different situation in the lake. First, there don't tend to be as many storms, and the water doesn't move as much. Second, remember how we talked about all of the nutrients that washed into the lake during the springtime? All of those extra nutrients in the water mean that phytoplankton tend to grow a lot in the summertime. Finally, and most importantly, as the hot summer sun starts to warm up the surface water, colder water starts to sink to the bottom. This is because hot and cold water have different densities. In other words, the cold water is heavier than the warm water. As the surface water warms, but the bottom water doesn't, you eventually have two distinct layers of water, the warm surface water and the cold bottom water. Now, remember all that phytoplankton growing? There comes a point when that phytoplankton starts to sink to the bottom of the lake, and some of it dies there. At the bottom of the lake, there are lots of bacteria that eat all those dead phytoplankton. Actually, those bacteria eat up anything that sinks to the bottom of the lake. However, those bacteria use up oxygen as they eat dead phytoplankton and animals. Normally, this lost dissolved oxygen can be replaced by the oxygen mixed into the water from the atmosphere. But remember those two layers of water? It turns out that where those layers meet is like a wall, and oxygen can't get mixed into the bottom water. Okay, well, we can't get oxygen from the atmosphere, but what about the phytoplankton that's still alive in those bottom waters? Don't they produce oxygen too? It turns out the places where those cold bottom waters tend to form don't tend to get a lot of sunlight, and therefore not a lot of photosynthesis. So phytoplankton are not replenishing the oxygen. As a result, the oxygen keeps getting lower and lower until there's little or none at all. A lot of animals live in these bottom waters, so when dissolved oxygen gets low, they get pretty stressed out. Some organisms can tolerate the low amount of oxygen. Of those that can't, some are able to escape the low oxygen bottom waters by pushing past that invisible wall and finding safety in the oxygen-rich surface waters. However, not all of those animals are capable of leaving the sediment or can't tolerate the warm surface water beyond that invisible wall, and, as a result, may end up dying due to not having enough oxygen. The word we use to describe these low oxygen conditions is hypoxia, and it happens in a few places in the Great Lakes. The largest of those places is the central basin of Lake Erie. Each year, hypoxic zones can cover areas that are thousands of square kilometers big. In many years, hypoxia covers 4,000 square kilometers at some point, which is bigger than the state of Rhode Island. Sorry, Rhode Island. Not only that, but because of wind and waves, these zones of hypoxia can even move around. You've seen how these hypoxic zones can stress wildlife out, but they can also cause other problems, like turning your drinking water yellow. That's a whole separate topic, but hopefully you can see why hypoxia can be problematic for people who get their water from the Great Lakes and play in the Great Lakes. Now that you've learned the story of hypoxia, you understand why scientists in the Great Lakes want to study and understand when and where it happens. To learn how scientists at CIGLR and our partners are studying hypoxia, check out our website. See you next time.
Alrighty. Well, so now hopefully you understand what hypoxia is a little bit better. And with that being said, I want to now take a little time to talk about the kind of research we do that involves hypoxia. So, for example, remember at the end of the video how I mentioned that hypoxia can turn your drinking water yellow? Well, what causes your tap water to turn yellow like that is when you have high amounts of something called manganese. And research has shown us that when you have low oxygen conditions, like with hypoxia, that the amount of manganese in the water can go up. So you might be asking the question of, okay, so the water's yellow. How else is this problematic? So first, to let people know what manganese is. Manganese is an element that you can find in the periodic table, and I've got it circled here. It is something you can find in plants. It's actually really common in the Earth's crust for my geology nerds out there. And it's actually something that both plants and people like us need in our diet. So a little bit for us is perfectly normal and healthy, but as with a lot of things, too much of it can be a problem, like that yellow drinking water we saw. And yellow drinking water can be an issue because, it can be a little alarming to look at. You kind of expect your water to be a certain color when it comes out of your tap, and when it's not, can be a little scary, and it can make you not want to trust your drinking water, which we don't want that. It can also stain your laundry, which is a nightmare for any of us who wear a lot of white shirts. And there have been some studies to show that there can be some potential health implications too. So there's a lot of interest in understanding in Lake Erie specifically what kind of relationship is there between manganese and oxygen? At what amounts of oxygen do we start to see a lot of manganese showing up in our water? And that's the kind of research that I work on. So you can see off to one side of the screen here the many, many samples we've collected for this project. There are 10 of those big yellow tubs in total, and then all of those things on the rack. And you can see a little bit of the machine behind me in that other picture, and that's what I use to analyze all these samples. And I have some really cool videos of this, so if you kind of want to see a little bit more about that, feel free to chat me up after this, and I'm happy to share that with you. So while manganese is one element that we study in regards to hypoxia and dead zones, there are some other elements that we're interested in too, like phosphorus. Some of my coworkers do research very similar to what I do with manganese, but instead they're looking at the relationship between dead zones and phosphorus. And they actually put out a study pretty recently that Michigan Radio wrote an article about. So this is something you can go and find online. And after this talk, hopefully you feel pretty well equipped to read this article. Now you've learned what a dead zone is, you know what this article is talking about. When they mention, nutrients fertilizing algae and how the plants grow and rot, you know what this means now, and this can help you engage with this article a little bit better. And finally, I wanted to mention that our colleagues at the NOAA Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory are actually working on this pretty cool tool called the Experimental Lake Erie Hypoxia Forecast. So sort of the same way that you might go and look at a weather forecast to know what to expect for the day. Do I need to wear a jacket? Do I need an umbrella? The idea behind this hypoxia forecast is to help people who work at drinking water plants know when and where they can expect these bubbles of hypoxia. And that helps them know what to expect, and they can actually modify how they're treating your drinking water accordingly, so they make sure you don't get that yellow drinking water. And then finally, I did just want to mention a few resources that I can drop the links for in maybe the Q&A or something like that. But first off, our partners at Michigan Sea Grant have these amazing lesson plans talking about a lot of these cool science issues in the Great Lakes, and they have one for dead zones. It's really good. It's a full lesson plan. It's appropriate for grades 5 through 8. I also wanted to include a link to that hypoxia forecasting system we just talked about, and then a link to that Michigan radio article. And with that, I think we are at time. So I'm going to stop presenting, and if there are any questions, feel free to ask them.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Christine. And thanks again to everybody joining. As a reminder, if you're joining us on Zoom, feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions. If you're joining us on the Facebook Live, you can ask your questions directly in the comment section, and I'll be sure to read them out loud. So to start, Christine, I'm curious, I'm hoping you could maybe tell everybody a little bit about your background. What inspired you to pursue this line of research, and how did you get to this point?
It's actually been an interesting journey. When I was in undergrad, I actually started out in the environmental engineering program. And at the school I went to, NC State, they kind of did it as this mashup between civil and chemical engineering. And I remember taking the class where they were talking about water treatment. So they were talking about wastewater treatment and drinking water treatment. And I remember having this really this moment of like, wow, I really like this. Like, you know, that like clicking moment. And I actually ended up switching degrees later because I discovered that I was a little less interested in the engineering side of things so much as the science side of things. And I actually worked in a soil science laboratory where I looked at arsenic in drinking water in Bangladesh and Cambodia. And then from there, I went to grad school at the University of Michigan. And actually, my advisor was somebody who works for CIGLR, and that's when I first started working on harmful algal blooms, which I knew about because we have those in the coast in North Carolina too. And yeah, and then after I graduated with my master's, I started working at CIGLR full time. And since then, I've started transitioning into some of these other really cool projects related to biogeochemistry, which is the big word for it. And that's kind of how I've landed where I am now.
Awesome. Looks like we have a question from Nancy. Do we see hypoxia as a current threat in the Great Lakes to the wildlife there?
I would say it's one of those things where it's a problem. I would say it's probably not as big as in other places. So for example, you may have heard in the news about things called fish kills. And that's when, you know, you have a bunch of fish washing up on the shoreline. And it's interesting because you hear about that a lot in regards to algal blooms, but what actually causes that, as you kind of saw in this video, is that lack of oxygen. And so we do have some of those fish kills, and it's not great. But as far as like, if I'm like ranking the list of major issues we have in the Great Lakes, it's a problem, but it's not the biggest problem we have. But it gets a lot more problematic. Like, for example, if you check out like the Gulf of Mexico, like those poor people, they deal with some really big, they have a huge dead zone that is, it's almost nightmarish to look at. And so we kind of, I feel like we have a little bit of the light version of that. And so it's more likely in the Great Lakes to stress out wildlife, I think, than outright kill it.
Another question from Leslie. They said, hi, Christine. I have a friend who is a paint maker who had a stroke due to exposure to high levels of manganese used as a pigment. So it had me wondering about levels that are dangerous in drinking water. Do water treatment plants filter it out?
Hi, Leslie. That she has a friend. So, so off the top of my head, I'm trying to remember. I can't believe I'm blanking on this right now. But so manganese, something to know about manganese is, as far as laws that control the amount of it people are allowed to have in their drinking water, manganese is something that's called a secondary contaminant. So when you're talking about drinking water and the standards that those plants have to adhere to before they send it to your tap, there's kind of these different tiers of contaminants. You have your primary contaminants, which are, you absolutely cannot go beyond a certain threshold. If you do, there has to be action. And then you have secondary contaminants, which are more cosmetic and aesthetic type issues, like yellow drinking water. And that's what manganese is in drinking water. It's a secondary contaminant. So it's interesting from a legal view, like how much is considered to be unsafe, because if you look back through newspapers and things like that where these events happen, because it actually does happen somewhat often, even when you have yellow water like that, they'll tell you it's perfectly fine to drink. There is some research that kind of combats that notion a little bit, but it's one of those things where it's not definitive yet. And, and I'm sorry, I can't remember right off the top of my head what the concentration is for when they start to see issues in people. But I will get that back to you, Leslie, about that later. I'll hit you up. As far as how they deal with it in drinking water plants, so they add something to your water when they know that the manganese is going to be high, called permanganate, which ironically is also a form of manganese. But manganese is actually pretty cool the way that it behaves in water, that you can react manganese with manganese to make it change its form. So they add something called permanganate to the manganese that basically takes it out of that dissolved form, like we talked about in the video, and it turns it into something closer to a particulate form. And that's something that you can settle out and remove and then pass on the filtered water. So that's how they deal with it. And they actually can do a pretty good job of it, as long as, again, they know when to expect it. Although there was this one really amusing incident. I'm trying to remember where this happened. So permanganate by itself is this very bright pink, like a lot like the background that's on Catherine's Zoom profile, like very bright pink. And there was a point where they accidentally overshot and added way too much permanganate, and people actually had bright pink water coming out of their tap. Or you can imagine if yellow water was freaking people out, the pink water was really drawing some concern. But yeah, so that's how they deal with it, and they can do it pretty well. But again, it's just a matter of them knowing when to expect it.
Leslie had a follow-up question. So this is not like PFAS where there's no safe level, even if not legally stated as of yet?
No, yeah. So again, manganese is actually something you do need a little bit of. So you'll, like, if you ever look at a vitamin or something, you'll probably see that it's got a little bit of manganese. It's kind of similar to iron, like you need a lot of it, but we've seen instances in the real world where it causes huge problems when you have too much of it. And so it's one of those ones where there's definitely a safe consumption of it, and really, like, especially if you have well water or something, you probably are going to have relatively high levels of this stuff, and it's not going to do you harm. So it's not like PFAS where there's like no safe level. There's definitely a safe level of manganese. And in fact, there's a level that you want to be having to have a well-rounded diet.
Great. Well, with that, we're actually out of time, but I want to thank you again so much for joining us, and to Michelle and Peter as well, all of CIGLR for your talks and presentations today. If people want to learn more, where can they go to learn more about all of your incredible work and research?
They can, first of all, visit our booth, but then they can go to our website, which is the Cooperative Institute for Great Lakes Research, But I would also suggest for them to go to our federal partner website, which is NOAA's Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory in Ann Arbor. CIGLR is, as a research institute, we work with our NOAA partners at the lab, and there are probably about 80 of us that work there. Right now, mostly remote, obviously, but it's a wonderful laboratory. And I think if you check out both websites, you would find a wealth of information.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Be sure to check out the rest of today's events at the MSU Science Festival, as well as the events that we have going on throughout the entire month of April. You can learn more at sciencefestival.msu.edu. Thanks again.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, everybody.